The land of Britain was once considered a myth by the mighty Roman Empire. To them, it was nothing more than an old legend. This would change in the year 55 BC when Julius Caesar set his sights on this fabled island and sailed towards its shores. The historical discovery would end in defeat. Almost a century later, the Romans found glory when Roman Emperor Claudius stepped foot on British soil. They set their eyes on Stonehenge, using the sacred site for their worship and rituals. Londinium was established, and the Romans seized control of the land. But what happened next in the history of the United Kingdom? To understand this fascinating land, we must start from the very beginning. What would become the United Kingdom began way back within the prehistoric Paleolithic period, which dates back to 950,000 years ago, a time that the earliest evidence of an ancient civilization dates back to. The first settlers that arrived in Britain were hunter-gatherers who traveled from Europe around 8000 BC and are now known as the First Britons. This group of people showed one of the earliest forms of economy, with the hunters trading native elk, wild cattle, and pigs while defending themselves from wolves and bears, which were rife in Britain at that time. Over the years, people have discovered a large quantity of tools, such as carved stone edges and hand axes. It is incredibly rare to find human remains from this period, which has made it difficult for experts to determine which form of hominids were living there at any particular time. With that being said, the tools that have been found give evidence that they were probably a subgroup of Homo erectus, like a species known as Homo heidelbergensis. Trying to follow the movements of the Homo erectus is also very difficult, with the early sites that have been discovered being divided by many years and spread out around Europe, making pattern forming difficult. At one time, Britain was part of the European mainland, and not the island we know today. This made it incredibly easy for groups to spread and relocate to other parts of the landmass. As the land moved and water levels rose, groups were cut off and were left to evolve. These early inhabitants relied heavily on both hunting and scavenging, which have been proven by the wooden spears discovered in Essex, which are believed to have been crafted around 450,000 years ago. It is often the stone tools that survive, so finding wooden remains is an incredibly rare and valuable find in terms of the information they provide. The hand axes would often get worn down over the years, with flint flakes chipping off them. It is these flakes that give archaeologists a trove of information, especially when they can trace the technique of making them, the complexity of the tool, and the type of stone used. In fact, hand axes were not used to chop down wood, but were more likely a way of cutting up animal carcasses for eating. Because of the simplicity of the tool and the expertise of the hunters after creating several of them, they've been discovered in high volume at some ancient sites. This proves that groups often returned to certain places and that they chose not to carry the tools with them as they traveled, instead making new ones on arrival. As the techniques in tool-making advanced, the Neanderthals of Britain began strategizing with their weapons to hunt larger prey like woolly rhinos or mammoths that once called Britain their home. The next phase in the prehistoric period is known as the Upper Paleolithic era, which saw humans physically evolve into what we are today, with only a few elements of our ancient ancestors still surviving in one form or another. This is why we still have wisdom teeth, which were once crucial for eating raw food. At this time, Europe would have been an incredibly harsh and cold place to live as a result of the last ice age. This led to many inhabitants leaving at certain times when the climate dropped to ensure their survival. This was not only to prevent freezing to death, but to ensure that they were able to find plenty of vegetation and animal prey all year round. Limestone gorges also offered shelter to people living in Britain around this time, with deep caves and overhangs being invaluable places to set up camp. Around 11,300 years ago, Britain began to warm up, which began a substantial phase of growth, which saw birch and pine trees flourish, as well as other forms of greenery. Other forms of woodland also spread across the land, including oak, hazel, lime, and elm, which are still in abundance to this day. Particular animals that remained after the colder climate changed, such as reindeer and horses, drawing hunters that were accustomed to tracking and killing the animals. This led to many of them traveling across Europe and settling in Britain. As the climate continued to warm up, many of the inhabitants had to change their prey to red deer and boar, as other animal species migrated or died out. This change of prey forced humans to evolve their tools and technology in order to survive. Around 6,300 years ago, during the Mesolithic period, many groups began setting up winter and summer camps, which allowed them to live in an ideal environment that catered to their needs when the natural climate changed through the seasons. Sticking to one place would use up all their food and resources, such as wood for making fires. Without these things, they would perish. Spending time in another location meant that the local habitat could repopulate again, which humans could hunt once they returned. Coastal sites were often chosen for certain times of the year, which meant that humans began eating a heavy sea-based diet, which mostly consisted of fish and mollusk. This also helped develop tools that could be used to help catch water-based prey, further expanding their knowledge and curiosity about the ocean. The transition from hunting and gathering came about around 4100 BC, which was aided by the arrival of agricultural techniques that came from the east. This was propelled by the population boom seen during the late Mesolithic period, which meant that the animal resources they previously relied on were depleting fast. The British landscape began to change soon after, with the inhabitants making mass flint tools, which were equipped with wooden handles. These were used to clear the land, so that fields, pastures, and settlements could be created. Barley and emmer were the first main crops grown for a vegetative food source, while pigs and cattle were captured and bred so that they could generate their own meat sources, rather than kill them straight away for food. This shift to building a self-efficient settlement saw the first domestic buildings, which included large, narrow wooden buildings known as longhouses. Another form of domestic building were structures for the dead to be stored and respected, known as long barrows. The Neolithic period introduced several huge changes to Britain, especially when it came to technology, landscape, and settlements. The causeway enclosure became popular at this time, which were circular monuments built up banks and ditches forming a ring around the settlement. Structures known as cursuses were often built within the circular banks, with the longest enclosure ever discovered in Britain measuring an incredible 10 kilometers, which is around 33,000 feet. When it came to hunting, the way that settlers created arrowheads evolved, with the design appearing more like a leaf shape to aid its aerodynamics. These later changed to chisel and transverse arrowheads to further improve their craft. This was a result of social changes, which were no doubt influenced by different groups mixing that shared their crafting expertise. The chisel arrowhead was easier to use, which could be glued or bound to an arrow shaft, which made production far quicker. During the middle of the Neolithic period, the British settlers began to slow down when it came to wild animal hunting, instead depending on their own livestock. Afterward, arrowheads became less sharpened as they were used as a deterrent against other settlements, stealing livestock rather than killing the thief. The reason for this could have been down to rising social pressures that forbid murder as a punishment for any injustice. Between 2600 and 2200 BC, monuments known as henges were erected, one of which being the famous Stonehenge found in Wiltshire, England. While there is no definitive proof, it is believed that the henges were used for rituals and astronomical observation. Because the ditches are located inside of the banks, experts have concluded that it wasn't used as a form of defense, but rather as a symbol of defense. During the later Neolithic period, pottery and tools began to change. During the early Neolithic era, pottery was often round-bottomed bowls with necks that sloped down. By the late Neolithic, the style changed to flat-based pots that were decorated by etches made during the drying process. These early pots were primarily used to brew and store beer, although dairy products and stews were also contained in them. With groups gathering and technology quickly advancing for the prehistoric people of Britain, it was time to move into the next critical era for their advancement. The Bronze Age. The arrival of metal and beaker-style pots represents the change in Britain, ushering in the Bronze Age of the country that began in 2200 BC. Bronze alloy was actually much rarer than iron ore, which meant that the resource was reserved for tools. White gold was primarily used to create jewelry. The other alloy used by people during the Bronze Age was tin, which was also quite scarce in Europe. Because bronze can be cast at a much lower temperature than copper, it meant that bronze casters could use molds to create more elaborate designs, such as daggers, halberds, and axes, which were far more durable than the stone tools that came before them. Bronze is also much harder than copper, as the tin within it reinforces it on an atomic level. Beaker pots were still used after bronze was utilized, with their different designs, decorations, and refinements improving as time went on. In fact, intact beakers and pots that were used in the burials give an insight into the craftsmanship, which sometimes still has honey residue in them from the beer they drank. Daggers were made longer during the middle of the Bronze Age, which became the first swords made in Britain, which were called rapiers. As social tensions grew between the different groups of people, more variations of weapons and shields were made. There is even evidence that neighboring settlements could have used the weapons heavily by the damage sustained to them, although they could have been intentionally damaged before being placed in hoards to prevent anyone else from using the swords against them. While there is evidence of human remains being cremated in the Bronze Age, it's likely that much of the remains were scattered or placed in moving water. This is evident from the lack of bones found within burial sites, where more bodies should have been located. This shows how the people of this time mastered fire and ways of increasing its heat to successfully burn human remains and cast metal. It was during the Bronze Age that boundaries around land started appearing, which were traded and claimed by dominant families. Livestock pens and agricultural fields became an important part of everyday life, as well as the copper mines that provided jobs for inhabitants and allowed metalwork to advance at a very swift pace. A historically important site was discovered at Great Orme in Llandudno, Wales, that provided 90% of the ore used to create axes all around the northwest of Europe. From 1000 BC, another change in climate resulted in many areas of Britain becoming uninhabitable, mostly due to the lack of crop growth in the cold conditions. Also, areas that were once ideal for growing vegetation became wet and boggy. With the eruption of the Hekla volcano in Iceland blocking out much of the sunlight, with the land becoming inhospitable, many settlers moved on from the land, while others repurposed the fields for strictly raising livestock. Those who refused to leave were forced to build walkways and raised settlements over the wetland beneath, which inadvertently improved their structure-building skills. The most preserved examples of cloth, food contained in pots, tools, furniture, and wooden objects were discovered within the fens below these settlements, as they would have dropped down or fell in after a structure was attacked and broken down. Because of the lack of oxygen and muddy conditions of the bogs, these items were preserved for millennia. Near the end of the Bronze Age, the long, pointed rapier blades evolved into long, flat blades, with a full tang going into a cast handle. Now, weapons were not only becoming an art form for the people of the Bronze Age, but a necessity for their survival. Hordes of weapons became rarer in the Bronze Age, which is believed to have been a result of its value dropping. This led to crafters, known as founders, to hold back their wares in order to raise its value. This is the first example of market strategy in British history, which later became an incredibly important factor in its economic growth. The Iron Age began around 1200 BC in the Middle East and southeast of Europe, which is best known for the extensive iron and steel crafting that took place. While it was rare, there were some settlers who were dabbling with the smelting of iron during the end of the Bronze Age. Although it wasn't until the Iron Age that the craft skyrocketed around Europe. The Iron Age was vital to the advancement of the human race, as it helped speed up civilization growth, provide more resilient and permanent settlements, and opened up more possibilities when it came to crafting tools and creating weaponry that kept up with the advancement of other groups spread around Europe who could pose a threat. Because steel is much stronger than bronze and lasted longer, it improved the creation of tools. These tools were also developed for agricultural use, which further established long-lasting settlements around Britain. It wasn't just tools and weaponry that saw an evolution, as art, farming techniques, religious beliefs, and alphabetic writing started to rise in Britain. The European Iron Age started in the Mediterranean region and moved towards the center of Europe as the years went by. In 600 BC, the skills in iron crafting spread to the northern part of the continent. The early Iron Age was dominated by a group called the Hallstatt Chiefs, who were the elite and most powerful of the age. It was within this culture that saw the first fortified hill forts, with domesticated animals and livestock raised on their land. These would later become castles and palaces, which were not only a form of defense, but a way to boost the wealth of their family. In 450 BC, however, the Hallstatt culture crumbled and the chiefs lost their power. This led to other groups rising to power in Europe, including the Mycenaeans, Greeks, Etruscans, Romans, and Celts, who used their iron and steel manufacturing to craft durable weapons and advanced armor. Out of all of these groups, it was the Celts that became the most powerful. The Celts were broken up into different tribes that were spread throughout Britain. Despite being advanced enough to share a common language, they were named after Keltoi, which was the Greek word for barbarians. The Celtic culture began to rise as early as 1200 BC, with the group spreading throughout Britain, Ireland, France, and Spain as their population grew and moved around. Although they stayed mostly in Britain and Ireland, with some of their vocabularies still existing in modern-day language. While they were around for a considerable amount of time during the Iron Age, it wasn't until around 700 BC that they were documented in history by the Romans, who called them Gaeli, another word meaning barbarians. Despite their name, the Celts were among the most successful people in British history, with them controlling many parts of the continent, which include current-day Ireland. While the Celts thrived for centuries, when the Roman Empire grew and spread across Europe, Julius Caesar launched an all-out attack on the Celts, slaying thousands and crushing their settlements and culture to claim their territories. Caesar's Roman army later tried to invade Britain, but they failed, allowing the Celts to populate the land. But when it comes to the Romans' involvement in the history of Britain, their story was only just beginning. As the Roman Empire continued to grow, they eventually took control of most of Britain. Before then, the empire had dominated the Mediterranean Sea. They successfully stormed the ancient cities of Carthage and Macedon before taking control of Egypt and Syria. After traveling through the Alps, they eventually reached Albion, which was the original name for Britain. By the time the Romans arrived, the Iron Age settlements had advanced further, having thriving agriculture, wooden structures, and large communities. Trading routes had also been established between the Britons and the people of Gaul, who lived in what we now know today as France and Belgium. Here, wine and the first forms of currency were traded. While Julius Caesar failed to take full control over the island, he returned in the years 55 and 54 BC out of stubbornness and his interest in taking control of the trading that was going on. Caesar planned on disrupting the Belgae trade routes in the English Channel and believed that the Britons were going to help their friends across the sea as a response to the hospitality. This made the people of Britain enemies of the Roman Empire. Caesar managed to persuade the Roman Senate to support his invasion of Britain, telling them the land was rich in silver, a claim that he had no proof for. Before its discovery, Britain was hidden away and had gone undetected by the Romans. In fact, many people in the empire thought that the island of Albion was a myth, a legend that told of barbaric groups who were involved in a practice that disgusted the Romans to their core. They drank milk from animals. Caesar's plan to invade and take control of Britain didn't go down well, with the Romans having to retreat to avoid being defeated. Undeterred, he returned with 5 legions, which allowed him to storm across the Thames River, and he managed to speak with the chieftain of the Britons, Cassivellaunus. This meeting resulted in a peace treaty, with Caesar returning to the mainland of Europe to deal with a rebellion breaking out and a failed harvest that threatened starvation. Caesar never returned to Britain, and after a civil war, the Republic crumbled. Under the rulership of the emperors Augustus and Caligula, who continued to grow their empire in Gaul, their eyes once again set upon the barbarians across the Channel. While the interest was there, the time wasn't right, and beyond a symbolic throwing of javelins in the ocean, the invasion never came. In the year 43 AD, however, Emperor Claudius sailed across the sea with 4 legions, with Aulus Plautius leading the charge. Reaching Richborough, located on the east coast of Kent, the invasion of Britain began. Despite only spending 16 days on the island, the glory-seeking emperor returned to Rome in the year 44 and was hailed a hero. Despite the emperor leaving, the empire continued its invasion. They swiftly took the territory of Cativellani, a Celtic tribe state, before spreading north and west. By the year 60, much of Wales was under Roman control. Roman kingdoms were created in modern-day Norfolk and other places, with the Vespasian, who would later become emperor, sending his legion to the southwest to capture tribal settlements. It was around this time that cities like Londinium, which would later be known as London, was built. While the Romans seemed like an unstoppable force, the Britons continued to resist them. A member of a Celtic tribe called Caradicus managed to persuade groups in Wales to help fight the Romans, but he was captured. He managed to escape captivity and fled to a region ruled by the ancient Britons known as the Brigantes, but the queen chose to hand him back over to the Romans as a sign of newfound loyalty. Caradicus was sent back to Rome with his family as prisoners and, surprisingly, was spared death by Claudius. Boudica, the Roman ally and wife of Prasutagus, who was the client king of the Iceni tribe, headed a revolt against the empire. After the death of her husband, half of his kingdom was to be given to the Romans, while Boudica would be left to rule the other half. Rome wasn't happy with sharing the kingdom with somebody they classed as a traitor and decided to plunder the whole thing. If they couldn't have all of it, then nobody could. Boudica retaliated by sending her army to Londinium, where towns were plundered and burnt down. According to the Romans, 70,000 Romans were killed as a result of the revolt, although Boudicca and her forces were eventually defeated thanks to the expertise of Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. Boudicca was believed to have ended her own life with poison rather than surrender to the Romans. The Romans went on to defeat the Druid stronghold at Anglesey, who were targeted for their religion that was opposed to the empire. This decision led to the emperor being replaced with Turpilianus, who saw a great change in the way the Romans ruled Britain. Eventually, Britons gave in to the Roman culture, and the previously plundered towns and settlements were rebuilt, including London, which became the capital of the Romans living in Britain. Taxes were introduced, mining techniques were improved, livestock and grain production was increased tenfold, and the trade industry flourished, including that of slaves. It was during this time that roads were established throughout the country that connected key locations, such as London, York, and the Welsh border. This innovation built valuable trade networks and increased the affluence of the capital. The Romans were not yet done when it came to controlling, however, as they later moved into northern Wales, as well as sailing over to invade Ireland. The Romans further implemented their culture in Britain, building amphitheaters, Roman baths, and teaching Latin to its inhabitants. By the year 130, formidable military garrisons were built throughout the continent and other territories ruled by groups the Romans considered barbarians, such as the Balkans, were encouraged to aid in the Roman expansion. Britain was eventually split in half, which was called Britannia Superior and Britannia Inferior, in order to rule more efficiently. The problem for the Romans was that the more they spread out, the more attention they got from other enemies. The island saw a barrage of attacks from the Picts of Scotland, the Scots of Ireland, and the Saxons who traveled from Germany. For a period, a successful rebellion led to the kingdom separating from Rome, although it was recaptured in the year 296. By the end of the 4th century, and with the emergence of Christianity on the continent, the Romans slowly lost control of Europe. The lack of food resources such as grain spelled the end of the Roman Empire. As the last emperors withdrew, British cities were given the message that the citizens now had to fend for themselves, as the empire finally fell. This is where local governments were created, overthrowing the Roman magistrates that had governed more centuries. Despite Britain no longer being a part of Rome, their culture continued and shaped the country we see around us today. In the decades that followed, heretics battled Christians. Saxons from Ireland and Scotland raided English coastal cities, and Europe began to fall in what was known as the Dark Ages. Britain broke into smaller kingdoms, and a phase of regression began. While Britain saw some truly formidable enemies, their most challenging foe was one they didn't see coming. From across the crashing waves of the North Sea in the year 793, a group of Norse people from Scandinavia reached the shores of Britain. The first major violent incident committed by these invaders was the plundering of a Christian monastery, ushering in the 300-year-old age of the Vikings. As more longboats arrived, the barbaric invaders began raiding coastal settlements around England, Scotland, and Ireland. Eventually, the son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, decided that it was time to take up roots on the island instead of simply pillaging them. This group of invaders would become known as the Great Heathen Army. In the year 865, the army arrived at one of the 4 kingdoms of Britain, East Anglia. Fearful of the warriors, the king of East Anglia, Edmund the Martyr, offered the warriors provisions, horses, and shelter in order to be spared the violence, pillaging, and being taken over. Following defeat, Edmund the Martyr was captured, possibly tortured, and killed.